Yeah, thank you all for joining. It's always really exciting to see the energy that's behind this work. For all of us on the In Rhythm team, this is really our passion and our mission, really a labor of love. Just a little bit about myself and how I'm coming to this work. My career started as an ecologist, and I then spent a number of years running different types of organization, all focused on trying to address the most pressing ecological and social issues of our time. And throughout that process, I've always been having a focus on how do we bring ideas of systems thinking, holistic thinking, living systems thinking into the work that we do, in particular to help manage complex situations that all of us are in. And all of us as a rhythm come together because we recognize some really foundational issues that we are seeing in all organizations we've been part of in many different sectors. And we really feel this work, it has some significant contributions to help us all move forward in the work that we want to do in each of our different contexts. And it's great to see such a diversity here. So we will jump right into this, and again, leave plenty of time at the end to have something a little bit more interactive. Again, I wish we could all be in the same place together, face to face, but it is at the same time pretty cool to get to connect with you all scattered around the world in this way. So just a little bit about what to expect from this webinar. We're going to start talking about our current state of organizations today and move into talking about designing with living systems principles in mind. And as part of that, needing to have a discussion, or we'll have a discussion on actually what do we mean by life and living. And then we want to introduce you all to In Rhythm's design process or design thinking in terms of organizations, and then in particular, a particular framework that we've developed to really help create organizations, design organizations, manage complexity in organizations that we call the Regenerative framework. So we'll start off with a bit of a question, and you can either unmute yourself to answer this or type something in the chat. But what does everybody feel is the dominant metaphor for organizations today? When you think about what our organizations are designed after, what example it is, what would you say the dominant metaphor is? And if Alex, do you want to read some from the chat? I'm having a hard time with.
Yep, I was just gonna ask if you're able to see. So we've got a couple people who called out machine.
Absolutely, yeah. Any others? A machine, for sure.
Someone says tree branches.
That's great. You're clearly working in a great organization. Least has something living in mind, but yes, branch. I think you might mean from a hierarchical perspective. That's true. A lot of branching.
We've got another response that says cells.
Well, great. That's wonderful. I hope there's more and more organizations being designed with living cell in mind. But I would say, really, probably the dominant organization we look across all sector is this idea, certainly of a machine, right? Here's just two random examples of a quick Google. On the left is a consulting firm describing how to run your organization as a machine with each different department as gears working together. Or on the right, this is an image of Georgia's economic engine, right? How to, again, with each of the different sectors being different parts of a machine. And we've really inherited this from, our industrial revolution and a lot of our organizations being designed in this way. And we even refer to our bodies, or imagine our bodies, our medicine system imagines our bodies as a machine. Here's an image from early 20th century, actually comparing each of our body parts to different simple machines and levers and grabs and bellows for lungs. And so, again, another question, what do you see are the consequences then of treating organizations as a machine? And in particular, if we think about what role humans play in that machine is, then we are parts of that machine. Again, feel free to unmute or type something in the chat.
We have lifeless places. We become cogs. Wholeness is lost. Alienation dehumanizes. Dead.
Yeah, not the most inspiring of places. And that's absolutely true. Even the idea of being treated as a machine or a part of a machine really elicits these consequences, these feelings. Just a little bit of, if we think about this from a really meta level, then the outcomes of running our organizations as a whole, our for-profit businesses, our nonprofit businesses, our government organizations, our foundations, we know this is having a tremendous impact on the living planet, right? There's many ways to think about this. This is just one, looking at the decline of different species or species extinctions from 1970. So we know there's tremendous environmental consequences. And ironically, or maybe the hardest thing is that it's not great for work either. It's certainly not great for people. This is results from the Gallup poll that they do every year on worker engagement. And the latest statistics that say only 13% consider themselves engaged at work. 63% are self-identified as not engaged, and 24% is actively disengaged or even actively sabotaging the workplace that they are part of. And Gallup estimates this has tremendous cost, not just from the human cost, but actually from the business cost, that this is a lost productivity of $400 to $550 billion a year just for the US economy. From an equality perspective, we see we're getting to a point now, this is a little bit old, 2016, where we have individuals with greater net worth than entire countries. And so this system of designing our organizations in this way after a machine with a few that benefit at the top and most are replaceable cogs in that machine is leading to this type of inequality in terms of worth and wealth. And then from an equity perspective, in particular a racial and gender equity perspective, this same system is creating lots of inequities in the sense that from whether you look at infant mortality, life expectancy, or all of these different issues, jobs, housing, race is still the #1 predictor of how well you will do, particularly in the US and many other parts of the world as well. And just a little bit of this is courtesy of a great partner of ours called the Gemini Group. In particular with equity, this inequities that we've created about specifically concerning race, just a quick mention that this is really designed. This is really something that's been created as well as many other complex issues. And this is just an example of some of the key federal laws that were passed that have created this inequities. And actually this design issue is, we see all of the consequences we've talked about as a design issue. And on one hand, this is a difficult thing to think about, that people have designed our system to be this way. On the other hand, it's extremely empowering because that means if we design to a different model, a different metaphor, then there are new solutions to be found and new possibilities. And so it's important to think about where this metaphor came from a little bit, this machine metaphor. We certainly understands from the sharing that many of us see the limitations of it. But it's good just to look back in history and understand that this really came out of the Enlightenment. It really came out of the beginnings of our scientific method. And it was originally empowering, that the idea to be able to observe and predict through reductionism and reason is deeply connected in most of our societies as connected to individual empowerment, because this was a move away from the idea that there was simply divine rights or fate that created the power structures or the decision makers in our societies and in our organizations. So in many ways, this machine metaphor is connected to the philosophical foundations for democracy, human rights, social justice, and much of our quote unquote Western civilization. And really, a lot of this can be traced back to the fact that Newton did such an amazing job of using this scientific approach to understand and be able to predict and be able to understand the physical laws that govern the universe. The issue is we then got really excited by this reductionist approach and this reason approach, and we assumed that we could approach all different human endeavors in that way. And as we come now towards 2019, we're realizing we're reaching the limitations of that reductionist model. Even Einstein in the 60s understood that when the number of factors coming into play in a phenomenological complex is too large, this reductionist scientific method in most cases fails. One only needs to look at the weather, in which case prediction, even a few days ahead, is impossible. Or even a few hours ahead if you live in a place like Boulder or Denver or in the mountain range type of area. And the issue is that reductionism and prediction work very well for complicated issues or complicated systems, but they don't work very well for complex systems. And we often use these two words interchangeably, but they're very different. A complicated system is actually very similar to a simple problem. It's just that there's many more things that need to be taken into account. So creating or manufacturing one of these or the machine you're looking into is extremely complicated, but it still follows these elements. There are known inputs. One can follow a series of steps and receive and get to a set of predictable outputs. Complex problems or complex systems, on the other hand, have dense interdependencies at the start. One doesn't even know exactly how to map out what the inputs are. You have quick nonlinear change as that system evolves, and quickly the outcomes are extremely unpredictable. And many different industries, many different aspects of society are recognizing that we're really working in these complex adaptive systems versus complicated systems. So if we're looking at improving our healthcare organizations or improving our education, there's a recognition that this is actually, we need to learn something about how to manage complexity to really do this well. Simply knowing rocket science, which is a complicated solution, is not enough. And so we actually think we're in the middle of another shift in perception similar to the shift that happened in the Age of Enlightenment, away from sort of fate and hierarchical fate-based societies to actually understand, moving from and moving into the age of complexity. So I don't think if we look back 30 years from now, personally, I don't feel this will be known as the digital age or the Facebook age or the millennial age. It'll be known as the age of whether or not we figured out how to manage complexity. And so we need new models. We need to look at new systems to really understand how complexity works and how to manage for it. And so at Rhythm in particular, we're learning to see what can we learn from living systems, because living systems have a lot of unique principles and characteristics and aspects that help them manage and work with complexity in ways that human systems or machine-based systems simply don't. But if we do this, it's really important to understand and be clear about what we mean by a living system and what metaphor we're choosing for a living system. Because there's a lot out there, and they have different levels of their accuracy, I would say, in how living systems actually operate. So here's one, of course, this idea of a circle of life. And if anyone's seen the newest version of The Lion King, it was absolutely amazing, a technological feat. But it's still based on this idea. Even some critics now have even mentioned it was, why are all these prey animals celebrating the birth of a new, Lion King that could someday eat them? And it's on this idea that, it's all balanced, it's all a circle of life. It's somehow the prey animals are happy to sacrifice themselves to keep this balance of nature. When in reality, the model is really looking at the cycles of life. It's really that cycles of predator and prey go up and down with each other. And what, of course, Disney doesn't want to show in a children's movie is that this is the outcome or the application of the circle of life, right? There's tremendous predation can be ugly, predation can be difficult, and certainly for this deer or this moose, there isn't a lot of altruistically being part of the circle of life in this image. And I always think humor is a great litmus test of where society is, and it's great to see that this is actually a toy you can buy called Circle of Life toys, and each one is a cute stuffed toy of a predator eating a prey animal of some kind. So this is one example here. And so if we are going to create frameworks, create new ways of thinking and modeling our organizations, then we need to be really clear about what we really mean by life. And the exciting thing is we're living in a unique time, because up to now, even the field of biology has had actually a really hard time defining what life really is. What is the difference between a rock and an elephant? And each of these different characteristics you see here, being composed of cells, being able to respond, being able to reproduce, these are all have been put forward as definitions of being alive, and they're all lacking in some way. In our online course, we go through an interactive exercise where we really unpack how each of these characteristics are actually limited. But it's good to know that one can go through this and recognize there are exceptions to each of these different definitions here. And so only recently has a group of scientists approached this question from a truly systems approach. This is the work of Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, both from Chile, Santiago. So this set of ideas has been called the Santiago School, and they were the first to take a holistic approach to life, to understanding what life is. And what they did was they took the simplest form of life, a cell or an E. coli bacteria, and they were managed to examine and map every single chemical, material, and energetic pathway. And the amazing thing was they found that they could actually recreate all of these pathways, recreate each of these energetic patterns outside of the cell in a test tube. But it would all lack one ability, which is in a test tube, it could not maintain itself, versus all of those exact same pathways interacting together within the cell wall, which a cell also creates. Actually, it could self-maintain, it could self-repair. And so the Santiago School actually realized that this is the defining aspect of life, that this ability to self-maintain, to self-regenerate is what makes something living. And they coined this term autopoiesis, or meaning self-poetry or self-making. So the definition of life they came up with, and something that we use and model after quite a bit, it's really at the foundation of our design work, is that a living system or life is an organized system that is capable of maintaining itself within a boundary that it also makes. So in a sense, the title of this webinar is Introduction to Regenerative Organizations. It could also be Introduction to Living Organizations, because actually living is equal to regenerative and regenerative is equal to living. It's the defining aspect of life. What's really interesting is the Santiago School then asked what are the other unique properties of life? And very interestingly, they found that this ability to self-regenerate is actually not located in any one place in the cell. It's not controlled by the nucleus or controlled by one of the other aspects of the cell, but it's actually dependent on all the interconnected relationships of all parts of the cell. And so that life itself, or self-regenerative ability, is itself an emergent property. It is a holistic property that's dependent on all the parts of the cell. And interestingly, each part of the cell is itself also a whole. It's also an autopoietic system, also a self-regenerative system. So we see that life is composed of wholes within wholes. So here's if we take a look at our own body, then we can think of it this way. We can think of each of our, different organs, the brain, the heart, the stomach, skeleton, nerves, as wholes in and of themselves, whole systems of themselves, self-regenerating systems. And we, as a living being, are alive on the left when all of those parts can interact with one another. And the ability to be alive comes from that interaction. Versus many of these organs, not yet, maybe not the skeleton, we can't, and nerves, but we can artificially keep each of these organs, the heart, the brain, the stomach, and lungs, sustain it outside of the body, but it wouldn't be living, it can't maintain itself, and it would not function in the same way together in a living human system. And so all of that background then will shift gears a little bit and tell you how we're using this modern understandings of the systems view of life to design organizations. And so we know that if we start with a machine metaphor or a design based on machines, that we then use this to engineer best practices. Right? Many of us have probably been asked to implement or research best practices in our organizations and learn from other organizations with the assumption that you can just translate these practices from one organization to another because all machines are relatively similar. When we design with best practices in mind, then we end up making sure that that works for our context or for our situation. And so we really enforce very prescriptive structures. So we say things have to look this way. This is what the best practices say. We must operate in this way, like the industry tells us to, or in a government situation, or in many of our situations, what we are regulated to do in a general context, not necessarily our own context. And these prescriptive structures then ultimately, this whole system ultimately degenerates, right? That we need constant input into these systems to keep the system running. If we think of all machines that need some sort of input from the outside. In contrast, if we start with a living system to design from and take some of the foundational understandings of living systems that we just presented, then we could use this understanding to really inform a set of principles to design to, right? And designing to principles versus practices is very different and much more flexible. So if we use principles, this really helps us facilitate the creation of a flexible framework that we can use to manage complexity. And we'll talk about our particular framework in a moment here. And if we can do this, if we can keep living systems principles in mind, design and manage and operate with flexible frameworks, then we can keep this aspect of self-regeneration alive or working within a living system. We recognize our organizations are living systems, and this ultimately regenerates the system. We understand that in the machine design, since we're constantly needing to put energy in from the inside to maintain it, to repair it from the outside, that ultimately takes more energy to manage. We need to keep putting energy into the system, and we need those external inputs. Versus in a living system, we actually ultimately need less energy or less input of energy to manage the system because the system is maintaining itself, and we are just creating conditions for the system to maintain itself. And a lot of our work in Rhythm then is recognizing that to make this transition, it really requires a shift in both perspectives and operations. So a lot of our work is both educational, things like this webinar, our online course, but the work that we're really committed to is how to really operationalize this in organizations, really how to help support organizations and provide tools for organizations to really land this and operate their organization differently as it is. So we'll talk about each of these pieces for a moment. We talked about living systems, and let's talk about what principles we have developed informed by living systems. So there's probably seen a number of different sets of principles like this, and it's great that there is a lot of overlap in our principles and others, and this is because they're all being informed by the same thing, which is living systems. But we see a living organization or living systems, the principles of regeneration being, of course, holism, meaning everything is interrelated and dependent. Mutualism, that since living is based upon the interactions of its parts, then there has to be inherent value and interdependence in the other. We recognize uniqueness, that each individual actually has a unique genius, an individual genius to bring into an organization, and that originality and possibility of one can create conditions for that allows each member to thrive. We recognize that regenerative organizations are evolutionary, that they have the ability to maintain a dynamic balance with their environment that they are part of, and we know that that environment is ever changing. Networked or nodal, I read recently, I think I agree with this, that actually the network is the basic unit of life. All life is composed of networks and networks within networks. We see in the cell itself, the cell itself is a network, and life is dependent on all the interconnections of these networks. So a hierarchical system that most of us tend to be in organizations is very centralized, and decision-making is is non-distributed. It comes from top down. So we see a principle of living systems is that resources and information and decision-making is decentralized and distributed. And the sixth, similar to evolutionary, we recognize that living systems grow, and the health of the system is what we focus on, and each member of the system and the system itself needs to be allowed to grow. We have a commitment to that development. So from those principles, we say we use those principles to create flexible frameworks. And so this is what Rhythm calls our regenerative framework. This is actually a design framework. It's a design process. It's difficult to represent something holistic in 2 dimensions, so that we have a lot of different ways to represent this, and we're thinking about it. But we also can think of this as a process moving from left to right. So we say an organization really, or any complex environment, starts with understanding the context. And the context of an organization is its purpose. What is it gathered? Why is a group of people gathered together to form an organization? What are we trying to achieve? We also talk about defining a quality of life, meaning not just what are we trying to achieve together, but what does each of our lives look like as a living organism inside a living organization? What does our life look like, and what is the quality of life together look, feel, and operate like? We then talk about, okay, what behaviors are needed to achieve this purpose and quality of life, and what is the supportive environment needed to support those behaviors and achieve those purpose and quality of life. The second column is probably a unique aspect of our work, which is we have a really strong focus on understanding the health of an organization. If we look at all living systems, the basis of self-regeneration, the basis of regeneration is having conditions that allow for it, that having conditions that are healthy enough to allow a body to heal, to allow an organization to self-repair, or a system to self-repair. If we take a soil system or agriculture system as an example, this is an easy one to understand, in that we know that the outcomes in a garden or in a cropland are based upon how healthy that soil is. That it really doesn't matter what we try to plant in that soil if the healthy isn't fertile and isn't the soil is not fertile or healthy. And so we say this is similar for an organization, and the crops that we're trying to plant is what we call organizational work. And when many of us are faced with a challenge in our organization, we're faced with an issue, we tend to go here first. We tend to say we need a new strategy. We need new products and programs. We need to change our technology and tools, or let's drive for some short-term outcomes. And what we say and what we help organizations recognize is that this ultimately needs to happen. One needs to think about this, but this needs to happen in a way that really allows for organizational health to be maintained or to thrive or to be developed. And if one doesn't focus on organizational health, then none of this will work. So we see organizational health as composed of four main processes or qualities. First is thriving people. The second is that those people need to be resourced and allowed to make intelligent decisions, which is what we call the information cycle, and that ideas and information needs to cycle. Ideas and processes need to be able to be recycled and reorganized and reused. We talk about communication cycle being the exchange of information, the exchange of resources between different parts of an organization. And ultimately, that organization needs to have diverse supportive community that it is part of. So the middle section of our framework is where we spend a lot of time with organizations to say, what are the structures that we need to be able to both maintain ongoing health or create conditions for health, as well as serve as a platform for the work. We are gathered together to do work. Work is the expression of our purpose and our quality of life. But we've all known and experienced that work can have very different qualities, right? At the start, we said when we design with a machine-based model in mind, where we're just driving for outcomes, that work can feel alienating. It can feel like we're being used. And I'm sure all of us in different parts of our life have done significant work, but we've considered it to be giving life, whether that is, for many of us, it's more of our hobbies. It's playing in a band, or playing music, playing sports, something that feels flowing and life-giving, which we put significant work into, but there's an element of joy. And that's because we've really focused on our own health and are operating our work out of a set of structures that allow for health. And so in many ways, we say this is the quality of work that we're trying to create in our workplaces. This is the feeling of work that we're trying to create in our organizations. If we can do all of this, when we have all of this together, the last column really is our aspirational wish and our outcome that we're trying to create, which is we recognize that we're trying to release unlimited potential in our organizations. There are aspects of emergence and aspects of creation that we can't imagine or predict. And ultimately, we are creating organizations that are more resilient to inevitable change, and ultimately are creating the value or the wealth or the impact, that we're trying to create in our organizations. So if using this framework, we really feel we are regenerating living systems. And so what does it look like? What do we really mean by unlimited potential and resilience? And here's just a couple examples of organizations working in this way. This is credits to the Savory Institute, which is a global organization that is regenerating grasslands around the world. A lot of our work has grown out of holistic thinking and holistic management of the Savory Institute. They've been approaching land management in this way. And the next picture you'll see is an outcome of managing land with a framework similar to this. And there's no external inputs into what you see this land become. There's no extra seed, no fertilizer, no external energy of any kind. And simply by managing with life in mind, regenerating this holistic way, this land was transformed into this in a very short period of time. In a social context, this is an example of, this was an abandoned used car dealership in Portland. And the city approached it in a traditional economic development way, looking at economic impact statements, looking at what could be developed there. And then an organization came together to manage the process in a much more equitable and much more community-based way living into many of the principles of our regenerative framework, and asks the community what the needs really are, what really needs to be here. And the outcome was, this was in a primarily Latino community in Portland, and the outcome was a community-owned and community-based mercado that is a food hall and an incubator for food entrepreneurs, and ultimately is an expression of the place that it's part of, an expression of the community it's part of, and also had these phenomenal economic outcomes that are also part of it as an outcome of creating health. And so I want to finish just trying to outline that the types of shifts in perspectives and operations that we are trying to help organizations go through. So we recognize that we really need to shift our thinking and our operations from moving away from just thinking about managing parts to really understanding wholes. And this means moving away from competition to really focusing on collaboration, both within our organizations and between organizations. A third way we think about it is, because complex situations are unpredictable, we need to move away from this idea of recipes or best practices or predictive behaviors to understanding responses or being able to create conditions to allow for responses. So it's co-designing for adaptation and resilience, and that solutions are context and community specific. We think about shifting similarly away from the idea of trying to predict the future and predict exactly what will happen, to understanding the patterns and creating conditions for health and emergence. The machine-based model really is based on extraction, right? Extracting energy from workers, extracting resources from the earth. And so we really need to move from extraction to a real commitment to equity and understand that people are the ultimate energy source. And we have to focus on the development of all members of an organization, all people, versus just a few at the top, creating wealth that is now equal to whole countries. And this ultimately means changing power. It means shifting power in our organizations. And so we're moving away from centralized power to decentralized empowerment, where each member of the organization can make intelligent and resource decisions. So we have a evolving and living definition of an organization that tries to summarize all of these sets of principles and this approach. And we think of an organization then not as a machine, not as to be just executed, but instead as a living, evolving, and naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. Just to give you a little sense of other offerings and how we can support you or your organization or your community or friends or other organizations. First is we offer free 30-minute needs assessments, just a chance to have a one-on-one conversation with one of our team members, understand a little bit more about your situation, and offer some advice about how we may be able to support you with a regenerative approach. We offer online courses. The next one's going to be starting November 5th, and we're actually offering a 50% discount. The email went out today or will be going out today. And so if you, we are trying to give back in a time of Thanksgiving. I know it's a month away, but the course is happening over Thanksgiving. And so we really want to give back to our community and offer our online course at 50% discount. So please check out our website or look at your email for that. I mentioned the Organizational Health Index, which is a specific, very easily administered and a great first step to understand a current state of your organization and the health of your organization. We offer a number of clients where we are offering a very specific business need, but within our regenerative framework. So if you are looking to do a new strategic plan or an HR plan, we provide ongoing in-house operational support for a number of clients, as well as financial planning, financial modeling, growth strategies. And then, of course, we're happy to come up with a custom engagement for anything your organization may be looking for. So if you have questions about any of that, please feel free to reach out to myself or Alex, and we'll just leave you with a quote from the great systems thinker Donella Meadows. The world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. We treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separable, simple, and infinite. Our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch. So thank you all for your time and your interest, and look forward to continued conversations in, I'm sure will happen in different capacities. Thank you.